Star Trek 2009 movie review. So this is a review of the J.J. Abrams rebooted Star Trek movie, which came out in 2009 and was simply titled Star Trek. This is also one of my scripted reviews where I go back to a review I wrote years ago on the weblog and try and make a YouTube video out of it. As you can probably guess by the fact that this movie came out 10 years ago now. I was, in my youth, a huge Star Trek fan. And of course I mention that as background because that informs a bit how I view this movie. I know some people don't like it when I get into a long rambling digression about my history with the movie instead of just talking about the movie itself. So consider yourself warned. I'm going to get into a long rambling digression about my history with this franchise. I first encountered Star Trek, I think when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I think it was the summer between 3rd and 4th grade. Was on a family trip. We were staying at a hotel, and Star Trek IV was on the TV. I had heard the name Star Trek. I knew it was like a series of movies out there somewhere, but I'd never seen it before. I'd never really particularly been interested in it. But I saw it and I fell in love with it immediately and fell in love with the characters. This was back in the 1980s when the Star Trek movies, the original series movies, were very big. Surprising now, isn't it? Because you rewatch those movies, Star Trek 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the pacing is all off by today's standards. But they were really big in their day. I think most people of my generation, people who were kids in the 80s, were introduced to Star Trek through those movies. So I was really into it. I watched, was able to track down the other movies. I didn't even realize that it was a TV show at first, but eventually I found out it was a TV show. At the time, it was still showing on network TV. I mean, it was in reruns. It had been in reruns for years by the 1980s. But it was, I think Star Trek was still shown as reruns for years throughout the 70s and 80s. Maybe into the 90s. So then I started watching it. It was on every weekend, 7 o'clock Saturday, 7 o'clock Sunday, right at the family dinner time. So sometimes I had to negotiate being able to go down and watch it. Could we please have dinner early tonight? Can we please have dinner late tonight? And I just got super into it. I was a huge geek. I've always been a huge geek. So not only did I watch the show religiously every week, but I got the books, what was it? The pocket books had all those novelizations or novels related to Star Trek. I also got like the books about Star Trek, the Star Trek Compendium, where like the episode by episodes guide and the guide to all the characters. I just read everything I could get my hands on. Huge geek. By the time The Next Generation came out, I was in 5th grade, and I think at that point it had only been like a year and a half since I had first discovered Star Trek. But a year and a half is a long time when you're a kid. So like, a year and a half is an eternity when you're an elementary school student. So by the time The Next Generation came out, I had considered myself already a long-time Star Trek fan. And like a lot of longtime Star Trek fans, I was initially skeptical of The Next Generation. And it didn't help that the first couple seasons were a bit rocky before it found its feet. So I started watching it, and then I stopped watching it. And then by about the 4th or 5th season, it was getting good again. And I heard through the grapevine that it was really starting to get good, so I came back for it. Was a avid watcher of Star Trek The Next Generation for seasons 5, 6, and 7. Star Trek Deep Space Nine started up about that time, so I started watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And then Star Trek Voyager came up. And round about the time Star Trek Voyager was, I don't know, in its 2nd season, I just got a little sick of it all, and I stopped watching Trek, at least stopped watching it regularly. I would still tune in every now and again. Every time a movie hit the theaters, I went and saw the movies. I was in Japan when Star Trek Enterprise came out, and this was before everything was available for streaming on the internet. So I just didn't catch Star Trek Enterprise when it was out. I heard it got kind of bad reviews anyways, and I thought the whole idea of doing a prequel was just a terrible idea. So I didn't really watch Star Trek Enterprise. I didn't see the last few seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine or Star Trek Voyager. All that is to say, I'm well versed up in Star Trek to a point, but I don't have encyclopedic knowledge of it. I haven't seen all of every franchise. But I was a huge fan of the original series. You know, looking back, I think to myself, oh boy, that was a lot of wasted time I spent watching Star Trek over the years. But at the same time, I do think to myself, boy, when you're 8 or 9 years old, that Star Trek, the original series, is just perfect. I rewatch every now and again, I'll rewatch the original series, an episode here or there. And I'll think to myself two things. I think, wow, this is incredibly cheesy. Like, I never noticed as a kid how cheesy it is. You definitely notice it now. And it's incredibly dated, which I didn't notice as a kid, but definitely notice it now. I mean, I was a kid in the 1980s, so it was already old by the time I saw it, but it's even older now. So maybe it's even more noticeable that it's so dated. Or maybe I just wasn't observant as a kid. I don't know. But at the same time, even though it does strike me that it's incredibly dated and incredibly cheesy, I also do think to myself, you know, this would have been the perfect thing ever for an 8-year-old boy. So I watch it and I see why it would appeal to 8 or 9-year-old me. It does, the original series still does seem the perfect thing for an 8 or 9-year-old kid. Okay. So that's my background to the movie. That's going to inform a little bit how I approach this review. So yeah, the review here. As you know, the premise behind this movie was that they were rebooting it, kind of. It was a tangent universe. There was some sort of, I guess, Nero going back in time had created a tangent universe splitting off. So you got to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. You had all your classic Trek, and that continuity was still there. It was not erased. So if they ever wanted to go back and refilm movies in the old universe sometime, and I guess now they are with that new Picard TV show, they left that avenue open for themselves. But then they just created a tangent universe which they could play around with. And my reaction, I think a lot of the reaction of most Star Trek fans was, yeah, okay. It's a tangent universe, it's not the main continuity. Go ahead and play around with it and mess it up, or I don't care, it's not the main continuity. I think it also helped that by the time this movie came out, Star Trek was pretty dead at the time. The Star Trek Enterprise had not done well. Star Trek Voyager and Deep Space Nine had I don't know. I got the impression they kind of petered out. Although I wasn't there, I didn't watch the last episodes. But yeah, definitely Star Trek Enterprise had not done well. And the last several movies, especially Star Trek Nemesis, had been really terrible. And you got the sense that the franchise was dead. The fandom was not enthusiastic at the time. So I think that apathy towards the franchise at the time as well gave them some leeway. But it was good in my opinion that they went off with a tangent universe. Now, this movie was really fun and exciting to watch. It had so many plot holes in it. Well, what do you do with that? I guess on one hand, you can talk about all the plot holes in it, or on the other hand, you can talk about how fun and exciting the movie was, and I guess you can do both. So let's talk about how fun and exciting it was, because I don't want to gloss over that, because to have a fun and exciting movie is not easy to do. I mean, most movies that you watch are boring, or they're not particularly good. So if you have a movie where there's a lot of fun action, if there's the forward momentum of the story is really carrying you in a fun way, then that's something. And this movie has it. So full credit to that. Now the plot. Now to be fair about this, the original Star Trek, you know, the original series that ran for 3 years in the 1960s, if you go back and you rewatch a lot of those episodes, a lot of the original series Star Trek episodes have ridiculous plots, lots of plot holes in them, and just don't make a whole lot of sense. So, given that the series started out with this really cheesy TV show, it does feel kind of silly to now be applying adult criticism to this movie and being like, oh, well, this didn't make sense and this wasn't realistic and blah, 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 blah. And I think actually that's true of a lot of geek criticism. I mean, it's the same with comic books, right? You have this medium which was originally designed for children. With the original stories that came out, you know, in the 1940s in DC or the 1960s with Marvel, were completely outlandish, didn't make a lick of sense. But now you have all this adult criticism where fans are going over plot holes and criticizing stuff that doesn't make sense. So somehow along the way, we grew up and then we started applying adult criticism to the franchises that we enjoyed as that we started applying adult criticism to the franchises that we enjoyed as children. And that seems to me maybe the definition of geek culture. That's what geeks do. But right, yeah, this movie. There is a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense. The Grand Canyon is not in Iowa. The villain is not so much a character as he is just a plot device. His entire plan and motivation don't make sense. The entire story relies on a series of unlikely coincidences. I'm not sure how Captain Kirk went from a Starfleet cadet to captain of the whole ship. Tons of other people have raised these points because, like, they're super obvious. I mean, everybody who sees the movie recognizes this. Does it matter? Well, yeah, kind of. It would have been a better movie if it would have made more sense. So I don't want to give the movie a complete pass on this. To the extent that it's got things in it that don't make sense, it does diminish the quality of the movie as a whole. But it's also a lot of fun. At the time it came out, I didn't get around to seeing it in the movie theater because I was living in the countryside in Japan, and to get to the movie theater involved driving into the big city, and it was like a whole day wasted. I got some flack on the internet back at the time from some friends who were really encouraging me to go see it in the theaters, and they said, it's really exciting, you've got to see it on the big screen. And I said, no, I'll wait for it to come out on DVD. And then when it came out on DVD, I thought, I wish I would have seen this on the big screen. You know, some of those space battles really did look like they were wasted on the small screen. I'm sure it would have been much cooler on the big screen. Of course, at this point in time, the movie's 11 years old, so we've all lost our chance to see it on the big screen if you didn't see it right when it first came out. The reimagining of the characters is fun. Now, it's important to note that the characters don't actually have to be exactly spot on, because they're not the old characters exactly. So, for example, the James T. Kirk in this movie is not the James T. Kirk we know from the original series. This is the James T. Kirk as maybe he might have been had his father been killed and he had been raised by an abusive stepfather. And assuming that there was some sort of ripple effect that went through the tangent universe where everybody's fates got slightly altered, then that could explain why all of these characters are starting off in a slightly different place than where we knew them from the original series. For example, the romance between Spock and Uhura was never in the original series, but there was some sort of ripple effect through the universe that started with the tangent universe. So now they all have slightly different personalities or upbringings, or that they're all starting off in a slightly different place. I think really the only thing we're locked into with these characters is their relative ages to each other. And I think that was right. I mean, Bones was always a few years older than the other members of the crew. Chekhov was always a few years younger. I've never checked their relative ages exactly, but I think that's right. I think the movie got it right. Captain Pike, I was a little bit surprised to see him starting off already as an old man, because, in that first episode, The Cage, he appears as a young man. But then I guess I was thinking it's never actually specified how many years took place between The Cage and when Captain Kirk became captain. Well, I don't know, maybe it is specified somewhere. You know, there's all these little details of Star Trek canon that I might have missed somewhere or might have forgotten along the way, because my fandom days are now a long ways behind me. But speaking of which, let's get into the nitpicking. Now, leaving aside the plot holes within the movie itself, talking about maybe the nitpicks you could find with larger Star Trek continuity, because I'm a Star Trek nerd, and that's what we do, is we nitpick the continuity. So, again, because they've created this tangent universe, they've bought themselves a lot of flexibility. I guess you have to be willing to grant them flexibility on the visual representations. So the actors, some of them do look similar to the original cast, but none of them are exactly the same. And some of them even don't look that similar. And then the original Star Trek was like was the future as it was envisioned in the 1960s on a cheap made-for-TV budget, which every other Star Trek reiteration has more or less disregarded. Like Enterprise, when they did Enterprise as a prequel, they didn't bother to go back and recreate the 1960s sets. They just imagined it as modern would look from today's standpoint. It upset a few fans, but I was of the opinion, even though I wasn't really watching a lot of Star Trek Enterprise, I was of the opinion, okay, I'll give this to them. The visual representation of stuff, I'll let that slide. Yeah, so, the nitpicks then. I think the big problem is there have been a lot of Star Trek episodes that have dealt with time travel in the past. Like a lot of them. Like, just Google Star Trek time travel. Wikipedia has like a whole list of them. All the ones that I can remember, certainly all the ones that took place with the original series and the animated series, in all those episodes, if you go back and travel in time, you are not creating a tangent universe. You are altering the timeline. In other words, in the traditional Star Trek TV show, there's just one timeline. If you go back in time, then you're screwing up that one timeline. And there have been whole Star Trek episodes about the need to go back and fix the timeline because somebody screwed it up by traveling back in time. City on the Edge of Forever is the most famous one. Am I remembering that title right? But I think there's like 3 or 4 of them, and an animated episode yesteryear, which all involve going back and trying to fix the timeline. So the whole idea that it's possible to create a tangent universe by going back in time is itself an inconsistency. Although time travel in Star Trek has always been not consistent, and it's never entire. There are a lot of episodes where the time travel doesn't even make sense. There was a Deep Space Nine episode, I think it was called Past Tense, where I thought the time travel did not make any sense on that because I don't want to get into this. We'll save that rant for another day. It didn't make sense in my opinion. So the Star Trek has already gone down the route of time travel stories which really don't entirely make sense. I'll give it a pass for now. Captain Kirk should have an older brother out there. And I know Nero altered the timeline, but the older brother is an older brother. So he would have been born before Kirk, before the moment that Nero altered the timeline. This is something I originally flagged when I first saw the movie, when I first watched it on DVD. I've since heard that actually Kirk's older brother is in this movie. You remember that scene where he steals his stepdad's car and he's zooming down the road and he passes a kid and he yells something out to him as he's passing him down the road? Apparently that's supposed to be Kirk's brother. So I guess he is in the movie, even though they never call him Kirk's brother. In Star Trek 4, Kirk said that he was from Iowa. In this movie, he was born in outer space. And again, even before Nero altered the timeline, it was evident that his mother was heavily pregnant out in the middle of outer space. So it looked like he would have been born in outer space, whether the timeline got altered or not at that point. I guess... yeah, that could still work. I mean, he could still have been born in outer space, but raised in Iowa. Maybe we'll let that go as well. The Romulans. Right, the Romulans are the main villain in this movie. And in original classic Trek, nobody was supposed to know what the Romulans looked like until the episode Balance of Terror, when it was finally revealed. Of course, again, Nero altered the tangent universe timeline. So, okay, in this universe, maybe they've had encounters with Romulans beforehand. It wasn't explicitly stated, but you can easily imagine it. Then, at another point, somebody is talking about, the communications officer is talking about listening in. And he says that the Vulcan and Romulan dialects are so closely related, he can't distinguish them. Now this, as far as I can remember, and if I missed something, let me know, this was never established in Star Trek before, that Romulan and Vulcan dialects were so closely related it was hard to distinguish them. I think it was established that the Romulans are an offshoot of the Vulcan race, that happened, I don't know, thousands of years ago, or maybe more than 1,000 years ago. So presumably their dialect would have diverged completely into a separate language, you know, like languages usually do. It also raises a question, I mean, in Balance of Terror, nobody knew what the Romulans looked like, and nobody knew that the Romulans were related to the Vulcans until there was that big reveal moment. If Romulan dialect was so closely related to Vulcan dialect, then even without seeing the Romulans, they should have been able to pick up that the dialect was similar to Vulcan just by the radio communication. Of course, assuming there was some sort of radio communication with the Romulans. I don't know, maybe there was never radio communication with the Romulans before that big reveal on Balance of Terror. AV Club has a review of Balance of Terror in which they point out that this whole thing about fighting this whole war with the Romulans and never actually seeing what they look like once is kind of silly. I mean, how was that peace treaty negotiated if they never actually met up? AV Club says over the radio, presumably, but then the language would have been the thing. But you know what? Languages, especially in the original Star Trek, are so convoluted anyways. I mean, there are so many episodes where they beam down and all the people in all the galaxy and all these different planets are speaking perfect English. And I know there's this thing about the universal translator, which is supposed to be on their uniform somewhere, which is meant to explain this away. But then in some episodes, they're captured and they're stripped of their uniform. So what happened to the universal translator then? Point being, I guess, languages and time travel are horribly inconsistent in Star Trek. So maybe you just have to give that a pass as well. The folks at Red Letter Media did a review of this movie in which they caught something that I had missed, which is in an old original Star Trek episode, Spock at one point makes a comment that Vulcan, the planet Vulcan, has no moons. Of course, in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek, there's a whole big scene that revolves around Kirk and Spock out on a moon on Vulcan. So, yeah, good job to the guys at Red Letter Media for catching that. They are much better geeks than I am. Much bigger geeks than I am, and that's saying something. Okay, anyways, to sum up, in spite of all my nitpicks, I enjoyed this movie. I thought the new cast did a great job, was largely charming, was completely charming. I like them all. I thought this was a great new cast. The first movie, as other people have pointed out, the first movie was all set up. So you get to the end of the movie and it's like, okay, here's the crew, now they're ready to go off and have new voyages. And at the time, people were like, okay, well, we've got this new crew, now what are you going to do with it? Now I think 11 years later, we know the answer to that, which is not much. They did 2 more movies, which were both okay. Both of them somewhat repeated the same formula of one big bad guy that everyone had to fight. And then unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's going to be a Star Trek 4. And very tragically, the actor who played Chekhov died in an accident anyway. So even if they did have a Star Trek 4, they couldn't get the whole cast back together. So it's a shame, given how charming and talented this new cast was. But I guess we've got 3 movies out of them, so that we'll have to be content with that. So, yeah, that's my review. I largely enjoyed it. It had a lot of plot holes in it. How big a deal are these plot holes? Well, it depends what kind of lens of criticism you want to put onto this movie. But judged as kind of... I mean, when I first saw Star Trek, I was 9 years old. And I loved it. 8 or 9 years old, I don't remember. I imagine anyone who was 8 or 9 years old and saw this movie for the first time would have loved Star Trek as well.